with a whole lot of truth. The Remedy Revolution is here for you. Ooh. And now here's your host, Aaron Page.
All interviews presented on the Remedy Revolution podcast are designed to provide information and inspiration only. Guests of the podcast may present opinions and anecdotes which are solely their own. And as always, before beginning any treatment protocol, please consult with your preferred medical provider. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Remedy Revolution podcast. My name is Erin, and today's guest is going to be talking to us about something that we have not discussed very much here on the podcast. We talk a lot about pediatrics and complex cases. However, we don't often talk about the process that brings us those kids, which is birth, of course. So I'm very pleased to have obstetrician Dr. Stuart Fischbein here today. And we're going to talk about something you might not expect. It is so good to have you here, Dr. Stuart Fischbein. Thanks for coming on.
Erin, thank you for having me. It's a delight to speak to an audience that I don't normally get a chance to talk to. So thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So I have to ask, so I know that you've been an advocate for home birth for quite some time now. What brought you to that decision? Because I know going into obstetrics, that probably wasn't something on the curriculum.
No, it wasn't an epiphany. It wasn't a sliding door moment. It was essentially just partly random chance and partly just the way medical practice was back in the mid-'80s. I finished my residency at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center in Los Angeles. It was a very good residency program. We were very well trained. We had an affiliation with LA County USC Women's Hospital at that time, which was the busiest hospital in the country, doing about 65 babies a day there, 22,000 babies a year. It's a ridiculously high number. And so we got very well trained in hands-on obstetrical things. And one of those things was breech delivery. Another one was twin delivery, forceps delivery. And we didn't consider them to be abnormal. We considered them to be a variation of normal, but we were very medicalized. And that's how residents are trained. They come out thinking that, for lack of a better term, pregnancy is an illness that requires treatment. It's not a normal state of the human body. It's an altered state. And of course, I don't think that way anymore. So when I finished my residency, like any other doctor in those days, I didn't just get a job working for an HMO, working a shift. I hung up my shingle, they like to say, and I hustled to try to build my own practice. And I shared space with other OBs, but we were not partners. And so I was always been a solo practitioner my entire career, which I think has been a big advantage for me in allowing me to do the things that I do without having to appease my masters. And as part of that, I covered doctors when they were on vacation, and I took their call, and I assisted them in surgery, and I worked at some free clinics. I became the medical director of 3 free clinics in Los Angeles, and I covered emergency rooms. And early in my career, I was approached by some local midwives and asked if I would take their home birth transports. And I said, sure. And clearly I didn't say sure because I thought home birth was a good idea. I'm pretty sure that if I had any opinion at all, it was that it wasn't probably a good idea. And I had no idea what a licensed midwife does, but I was open to it because it was revenue generating for me, some mercenary at the time. And that was probably a very fortuitous moment, because as I began to cover them, I would get some of their transports. Most of them were non-emergent. They were simply because a woman was tired, or her contractions had spaced out, or maybe her blood pressure had crept up a little bit. And they just needed some pain relief and some Pitocin, and they would end up delivering vaginally for the most part. We did have some emergencies and some problems, but for the most part, it was those that came in, and then there was a lot of time to hang around. And because I wasn't that busy, I would come to the hospital when I got a new client in, because I didn't know them. By the way, I didn't call them clients in those days. They were patients, but now we call them clients. But I didn't know them. So I would come in and I would spend some time hanging with them in the labor room, getting to know them. And then I would go off to the lounge with the midwife, and we would hang out, for hours sometimes, and we would just start talking. And whether we talked about current events or we talked about sports or movies, but a lot of times we talked about their clients and why were they doing this and why were they doing that, and how come you don't do this and how come you don't do that. And I began to slowly but surely hear of a completely different way of doing things. And it began to make a lot of sense to me. Fortunately, I was open enough to not, sort of have the tendency to blow people off and say, well, okay, that's them, but that's stupid. And I began to hear it, and they made a lot of sense. And the women themselves were very highly educated. They thought this through far more so than probably my own patients at the time. Had done a lot of research. It's west side of LA, so there's Hollywood people there, there's lawyers, professional people, and they had made this choice. So I began to see that there was a reasoning for it, and it made sense to me. And so after about 10 years of doing that, I started a collaborative practice with two certified nurse midwives in a hospital north of Los Angeles. Cedars-Sinai would not allow midwives to have privileges at that time. So, and for 15 more years, we had a very good thing going on. The midwives took care of all the normal stuff, and I would take care of the problems. So if a woman had an abnormal pap smear, I would do the colposcopy or the biopsies. If a woman had an ectopic pregnancy, I would do the surgery. If a woman had needed a C-section or had a breech baby, then I would take care of that. Otherwise, the midwives did most of the other stuff. And we really had good numbers. We had low C-section rate, high satisfaction rate. And of course, as you might imagine, because we were the only people doing this in this community, we upset the apple cart. And as typically happens when you bring new ideas into a community that makes people uncomfortable, you sort of start to get picked on. And so that's what happened. We get peer reviewed for silly things. And then they eventually banned the midwives, and they banned VBAC, and they banned breech delivery. And we got into a point where I needed to make a decision of what I was going to do. And the decision was either going to fight these hospitals in a legal battle that you probably can't win, or go off and do home birthing. And fortunately, by that point, I had developed such a relationship with the midwives in the community that they were all supportive of helping me start to do that. And so that's what I did. And that's my transition. It was a slow process over about 20 years. But interestingly enough, Aaron, after 25 years of backing midwives, I had yet to go to a home birth. So I was a typical obstetrician, sort of critical of home birthing without ever having experienced what it's like. And again, I got this window of wisdom from the midwives. And so I sort of ride on the coattails of what the midwives have taught me, and I've combined it with my medical background. And I began to question pretty much everything that the typical medical industrial complex does for pregnancy, just like probably a lot of your other listeners do for pediatrics and, other medical issues that you may cover on your podcast. And it's really interesting to see how often they're wrong. And I don't just mean that there's an alternative choice. I mean that they're actually wrong. They won't admit they're wrong, and they can't admit they're wrong. But all you have to do is look at outcomes. And if you look at outcomes, then something isn't right. And if you're willing to look at that, then you can see things. If you're not willing to look at that because of cognitive dissonance or, personal bias or stage one thinking, then you will stay in your zone because it's very comfortable to do that and keep your head down, because you don't want to know what you're doing isn't necessarily good for the people that you're caring for.
Absolutely. I don't know that I've shared this with our listeners yet, but in 2007, I had a home birth myself. And that was actually not my initial intention. I actually just was fearful of hospitals. I didn't want to go into the hospital, and I felt like I would be more comfortable in a birthing center situation. However, at the time, 17 years ago, there was no birthing center within 2 hours of me. And so, the only option that was given was that there was an amazing home birthing midwife up the street from me. And so I initially had a little bit of hesitation because, there was obviously, fear of the hospital, but also fear of the unknown, because I didn't know much about home birth at the time. But, everybody thought I was insane, right? And
not everybody, but people grew up trusting physicians.
Right.
I mean, look at the television shows that, I'm older than you. Look at the television shows that I grew up with. Marcus Welby, Dr. Kildare, Ben Casey. These are all beloved figures who were always to be trusted and always had the patient's best interest at heart. And were fighting the big corporations that were limiting the choices of their patients. This is classic. So this is the image that most people still have of physicians, even through COVID, when we've seen some absurdity that I can't even describe in words probably appropriate for your podcast, where trust has been completely broken. And yeah, so it wasn't unusual for for people to look at you. And then people don't, and again, we grow up, societies are different, eras are different. I think young people days are not afraid to speak. They're more open to letting other people have their values and speak up only when sort of asked. But older generations, it was more of a I'm the parent, you're the kid. It's a narcissistic sort of feeling that, how can you do this to me? You're having a home birth. You're putting my grandchild in danger. That's because they just don't know. They just don't know.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, one of the things that really helped me actually throughout the process was learning about the cascade of intervention. So I'd love if you could give us some of that information because something that I learned very early on was that the administration of Pitocin, for example, can actually increase pain for the mother, which then leads to often the epidural throughout that birth process. So we start this cascade of interventions early on and perhaps even prenatally before labor even begins. So maybe you could talk a little bit about that and how to set yourself up for success if, for example, the goal is a vaginal delivery, even if it's in the hospital.
Well, the answer to how to set yourself up for success is initially, if you have an uncomplicated pregnancy, as most women do, is to seek out midwifery care. Whether or not you're going to have a home birth or not doesn't matter. You have prenatal care with a midwife and maybe your OB at the same time. And you'll see the difference. And at least they work on preventative care. They work on developing relationships and limiting stress and asking about sleep and relationships and nutrition and all those things that your doctor can't really do in a short visit. Before I answer your question, though, we have to go back in time a little bit and we have to look at mammalian birth. So we understand why the cascade of interventions is so damaging.
Right.
Because when you think about how other mammals, and we are mammals, all our instincts are the same as other mammals, and I don't want to compare us for religious reasons or anything else. There are people that get offended this way, but let's just talk about the biology of labor. First of all, of conceiving a baby. It's not something you can plan. Okay, I mean you can try not to, but it happens whether you want it to or not. Growing a baby happens whether you want it to or not. Going into labor happens generally whether you want it to or not. These are called primitive reflexes, or not reflexes so much as primitive bodily functions, kind of like breathing or digestion. You don't think about breathing, you don't think about digestion. But if you have to give a speech, you might start to hyperventilate. You might get diarrhea, okay? Because your cognitive brain is now overriding your primitive brain. So when a mammal goes into labor, where do they go? They go off to a quiet space where they can feel safe, quiet, and unobserved. No mammal goes to the middle of your living room when you're having Thanksgiving dinner and goes into labor. No mammal is surrounded by other horses. The other horses leave the horse alone. And if there's a forest fire, if a predator is approaching, a deer does not continue to labor. A deer will put out the proper hormones, usually adrenaline and cortisol, and it will stop contractions. The deer will get up and run and will wait till it's safe once again to go into labor. And in this way, nature ensures the best chance of survival. We are no different. And when we disrupt that mammalian model, we are causing ripple effects downstream, whether it's short-term or long-term. And I don't know, we don't have enough time to go today into the details of that, but we have to think about we're obstructing nature's design. And one of the basic tenets that people should understand is that when we're going to meddle with Mother Nature, when we're going to intervene in nature's design, it's not nature that has to prove that it's safe. It's the intervention that needs to prove that it's safe. And most of the time, these interventions are not proven safe. They're just done, often with what I call a stage one thinking, of thinking of something that might feel good or sound good, but never asking your subsequent question, which is, does it actually do good? So if that's how mammals give birth, then what happens to the human female? Well, the human female is told when she's in early labor to come to the hospital, right? First thing, you're leaving your nest. And you're leaving a quiet place where you feel probably the safest generally. Not everybody feels safe at home, and I get that. Again, nothing I'm saying is all or nothing. There's no thing in humanity that is all or nothing. Well, there is, but not for the sake of our discussion today. But you're taken away from your nest to drive to the hospital. It's not uncommon for you to call your doctor at home and say, I'm having contractions every 3 to 4 minutes, and they've been doing that for 2 hours. And the doctor says, great, come to the hospital. So you pack your bag, you get in the car, you drive to the hospital, you go through triage, you fill out some forms, you go into a bathroom, you change into a hospital gown, you pee in a cup, you get in bed, they put the blood pressure cuff on you, they draw some blood, they put the belts on you, and now your contractions are 7 or 8 minutes apart. And somebody will say, well, what happened? I mean, I can't figure out what happened to my labor. Why did it slow down? It slowed down because you're a mammal and a predator just approached you, technically speaking. Right. And so your body slows it down so it can deal with whatever it has to deal with. And only when things are peaceful and quiet again will labor ensue. That doesn't always happen that way, but it's not uncommon. So then you're at the hospital now and you're 40 weeks and 2 days, and they do an unnecessary vaginal exam on you, and you're 3 centimeters. And they say, well, your contractions are spaced out a little bit. Why don't you go for a walk and come back in an hour? They might say that. So that's reasonable. So you go for a walk and come back in an hour, but you're walking around either with your butt sticking out of the hospital gown, or you're pushing an IV pole or whatever you're doing. It's sort of disempowering. And you come back and the contractions have still not picked up to where they were before, or maybe they have. But they do another unnecessary vaginal exam, and now you're 4 centimeters and say, oh, your cervix is changing, but you're going awfully slow. So we'll admit you and let's see what happens. And then they admit you and you sit there for an hour or two, and then they check you and nothing's really changed. And they say, well, you're here, you're past your due date. Let's see if we can't help speed things up. Now, speeding things up is something that you'll hear all the time in the hospital. And it's one of those stage 1 thinking things is, why are they speeding it up? For whose convenience are you speeding it up? Think about it. Why does labor need to be speeded up? It needs to be speeded up because they have limited beds and because they want to move you in and move you out. They want the baby out. They want a live baby in the bassinet. And how the baby gets there isn't necessarily their concern. And what happens to that mom's experience, that mom's future babies is not necessarily their concern. They want to speed up your labor. So they say, let's break your bag of waters. Now, probably one of the dumb things you can do at 4 centimeters is to break your bag of waters. You're not ready. You're not ready. Go home. Go home. Why do you have to be in the hospital? Well, we have to monitor you. Well, why? I've been unmonitored for 9 months. Well, now you could have a problem. That's their thinking, because the way we are trained in obstetrical jargon is that pregnancy itself is a high-risk condition. Therefore, they consider pregnancy not to be wellness, not to be normal, but to be pathology that needs to be managed. So now you break your bag of waters, and now still nothing's happening. But now they've got a clock ticking on you because they broke your bag of waters. And they say, well, we got to have that baby out within 18 hours or 24 hours or another artificial arbitrary number. There's nothing magic about 18 hours or 24 hours. It's made up, kind of like 6 feet apart. It's made up. They made it up. Seriously. Yeah. So then they say, well, let's start some Pitocin. And then you say, well, what's the risk of Pitocin? Oh, it's nothing. It just makes your uterus contract. That's your informed consent for Pitocin. Not that it competes with oxytocin receptors, and not that it doesn't do the same thing as oxytocin does. It doesn't make you feel warm and friendly and loving, and it doesn't cross the placenta and make your baby feel safe. It doesn't do any of those things. It doesn't help with milk letdown. It may even bind with receptors. So there are downsides with Pitocin. You'll never hear that. You won't get that. You'll just say this is safe, and let's just do that. And then the Pitocin contractions are really strong, and maybe the baby doesn't like it very much. So they say we better turn your Pitocin down a little bit. But you're still really uncomfortable. So then they suggest what? They suggest an epidural. So now you get an epidural, and now you're numb and you're not feeling anything more, but you're still contracting. And maybe they have to turn the Pitocin up because the epidural slows down your contractions a little bit. And so then the epidural sort of disconnects you from the discomfort, which may be beneficial, the discomfort with you communicating with your baby and helping your baby process what's going on, because your baby's world is changing for the first time in its life. And mom has always been there to help baby assimilate that through hormones and other humoral factors. And now you're disconnected. You're perfectly comfortable, but your baby's still getting squeezed every 3 minutes or so, and maybe more intensely because of the Pitocin. So what happens then? Well, now the baby's heart rate, they don't like the baby's heart rate. So they have to turn the Pitocin off a little bit, but you're only 6 centimeters. You're not progressing fast enough. And so if we turn the Pitocin on, the baby doesn't like it. And so you end up, and they say, well, your baby isn't tolerating labor. We need to take you for a C-section for fetal intolerance to labor. And you end up with a C-section with the baby comes out. It's perfectly fine. And everybody says, great, look, we got a baby out that was perfectly fine. Thank God you were here. And never realizing the obvious, that everything that happened to you was iatrogenic. They created the whole thing. Does that mean that it's true in every case? No. Again, we're going to repeat that caveat a few times today. We're not talking about every situation. We're not talking about that this is wrong in certain situations where women have a true medical indication to be in the hospital, to be induced, or to go for a cesarean section. But if you believe the data on cesarean sections, more than half of them being done in the United States, we're just talking about the United States, are unnecessary. So there's about 1.2 million cesarean sections in the United States every year, maybe a little bit more. So that's 600,000 unnecessary surgeries being done every year in the United States. How can I say that? Well, 50 years ago, the C-section rate in the United States was 5%. Now it's over 30%. That's a 500% increase with no statistically significant change in the rates of cerebral palsy, hypoxic ischemic encephalopathy, which is similar to the same thing, or maternal or neonatal morbidity or mortality. So we've done all these interventions leading to all this surgical and a birth with no obvious benefit, with clear obvious detriment. Because we know moms with C-sections, then if they want a second baby or a third baby, now are dealing with the scarred uterus thing, the whole VBAC issue, and unfriendly territory in some communities about that, dealing with the possibility of placental implantation problems, something called placenta accreta. Any risk that you might have saved for that one baby, you've now put on all the mom's future babies. This is all in the name of safety. Couldn't sort of be more oxymoronic in that everything that they're doing, pretty much everything, is antithetical to nature's design and is less safe. So that's typically the cascade of interventions, and you need to understand it in the sense of what normal mammalian birth would be like. And if you leave things alone in nature, most times it goes extremely well. I mean, how many other mammals, except recently I heard about some sort of gorilla had a C-section, but how many other primates have C-section?
Right.
Now they'll say, well, they lose babies and the more mortality and stuff. Yeah, that may, I don't know. I don't have chimpanzee and gorilla statistics, but it's a trade-off, and I'm not sure it's a beneficial trade-off. And what ultimately should happen is the woman should be given true information and then give consent. The whole term informed consent, Aaron, has been misinterpreted. People think that a doctor gives you informed consent. That's not true. A doctor gives you information, the patient gives consent. That's how it works. So I hope that answered that question. I can go deep, and I can really go deep in some of these things. And so you got to keep me on track.
No, I think that's fantastic. My son was born in 2007, and in 2008, The Business of Being Born was released. And, almost as a, I don't know, validation for myself, we did a screening in our office and, had all the local birth practitioners come. And interestingly, there were a couple of OBs who came and who were open-minded enough to at least, watch the film and they had their own objections, to certain parts of the film. But overall, I do think it was a really good educational experience for them. And a bit of validation for myself, for all the community members who, thought I was some wackadoodle or whatever. But ultimately, there was so much education that was missing just in my small community on the Central Coast of California. People did not understand, very, very simplistic kinds of information about birth. As you mentioned, mammals give birth all the time. The norm is to seclude and to isolate and to seek out safety as much as possible. So I love that you brought that into it, because it's such an integral part of the reasons why something like home birth really should be the norm. And the medical model of birth really is more of an interventionalist kind of situation, which is needed, but far less often than I think, most of us think. So I want to talk a little bit about you mentioned the rates of cesarean section being on the rise. And I know, it became very popular, and I'm sure it probably still is, although I'm out of the birth community lately, but to sort of schedule your birth, which to me was always such a strange concept. And a lot of this, I think, is predicated on the fact that so many of these doctors are utilizing ultrasound as a way, a measurement of giving people some kind of definitive weight of their baby. Well, your baby's 10 pounds. So there's no way you're going to be able to have that baby vaginally, which is completely ridiculous in my opinion. But I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, your opinion is correct. It's completely ridiculous. It's not scientific. It is coercive. And it's based on, there's several things, minor things like expediency and medical legal concerns, but mostly it's based on fear and based on economics. This is what drives the allopathic medical birth system. I think most of my colleagues are very good at pathology. And that's what an obstetrician is. Technically, it's somebody who's skilled in surgical birth. But only a small fraction of women need surgical birth. The true experts in normal mammalian human female birth are midwives because they're trained in that model. But doctors don't understand that. And then they're trained in a model where they are indoctrinated to fear birth. Fear it because of liability, fear of it because a bad outcome is terrible for everybody and nobody wants that. And if a bad outcome happens because you interfered, it's justifiable. But if it happens because you sat and did nothing, you're going to get fried. So you always fear what you don't understand. And since my colleagues, most of them, and I didn't either, and I was trained at a very good residency program, had no real understanding of normal mammalian birth. We didn't have any lectures on nutrition in pregnancy. We didn't have any lectures on lactation and lactation assistance. Matter of fact, when I was a resident, we had standing orders on the postpartum orders to give women shots to dry up their breast milk so they could bottle feed without getting engorged. This was standard fare in the 80s because we bought hook, line, and sinker. The line sold it to us by the pharmaceutical companies regarding baby formula. Again, stage one thinking that Mother Nature designed this perfect elixir and we're going to make something better. Okay. But we can also charge for it, right? And we can charge for the medication that dries up your milk so that you have to use our product. It's diabolical, actually, is what it is. So birth is seen in the medical model also in a silo. They don't see the intervention or the cesarean section as anything other than getting the live baby out. But they don't understand all the things that are required for that nature has designed and put into it. We just did a podcast, which is going to come out recently, on 2 women who are neurodevelopmental reflexology people. And they talk about the importance of babies having to travel the birth canal and figure it out and use their reflexes, and how when they don't use their reflexes, they're born by cesarean or forceps or vacuum. Sometimes what happens is that these reflexes don't get integrated and they persist long after they're supposed to disappear. Your newborn reflexes are supposed to disappear and are taken over by more sophisticated reflexes. And then what happens is because those reflexes remain, you can lead to things like attention deficit disorder, fidgeting, inability to focus, dyslexia, bedwetting. All these things can be related to how you were born, but that's not considered by my colleagues who love this medicalized birth model. They came out 2018 with the whole idea of inducing all women primips at 39 weeks, called the ARRIVE trial, as if lowering the C-section rate wasn't even their primary objective. Their primary objective was to prevent neonatal death or stillbirth, and their induction policy did not do that. So they didn't even prove their primary objective. And the secondary objective is they lowered the C-section rate from a ridiculously low 22% to 19%, which there isn't a hospital in the country, a private hospital or most public hospitals, that has a C-section rate anywhere close to 22%. So it wasn't even applicable to real life things. And then there's something called the Hawthorne effect, which I learned about, which is, how could you have such a low C-section rate? Well, the Hawthorne effect says that if you're being watched, your behavior changes. So doctors that knew that they were part of a study and they were being watched may have let women labor longer, even maybe too long, to try to have lower C-section rates than if they were just off in a private hospital in some community where they would have sectioned her before dinner so they could have gotten home to their son's Little League game. That's a very common scenario. And when I say these things, it may sound a little bit snarky to some people who are are all in on that model. But think, if you just take a step back for a second and stop thinking about yourself and just look at it, you'll see that what I'm saying, makes sense. So I forgot what the original question was, but do you remember what it was?
Yeah, we talked about the ultrasounding the babies prior
Oh,
to
the
birth and
size.
them saying the size is an issue
Yeah, they're
to,
geared to find
right.
problems. And so, especially maternal fetal medicine doctors, they'll find things that don't mean anything. And they may even tell you, this doesn't mean anything, but I want to see you back in 2 weeks because I want to make sure that things are going in the right direction. So, are you reassured by that statement? Or now for the next 2 weeks, are you worried? And the answer is the latter. I've talked about this a lot. It's like the movie Inception, where they say, they're trying to implant an idea into Cillian Murphy's head. And one of the guys says, well, why can't we just tell him to break up his company? And they say, you can't just plant an idea. He knows where it comes from. And he says, what do you mean? He says, don't think about elephants. All right.
Right.
Everybody who's listening right now can't help but think about elephants. So when you tell a woman, don't worry, this one little ditzel here doesn't mean anything, but I want to check it again in 2 weeks, all they're thinking about is the one little ditzel thing. Right. They're not hearing the rest of it. And so ultrasound always leads to more ultrasounds. And I'm not saying that ultrasound is never a good idea, but you have to remember that the people doing ultrasound make money for doing an ultrasound. And they make more money if they find something to bring you back and do another ultrasound. That is why in my practice, I did, because I followed the original golden rule, which is do unto others. And I said, all right, I'm going to charge a flat fee for my services, and that's going to include all your ultrasounds. I did charge for a 20-week scan. I was qualified to do them, and I did my own. But any ultrasounds, any biophysical profiles, anything like that, I did not charge for, because I wanted my clients to understand that the reason I'm ordering these is because I think it's necessary, not because I'm going to make revenue from it.
Mhm.
There's an absolute inherent conflict of interest in that scenario. And then, of course, they fear everything. So your baby's too small, your baby's too big, the fluid's too much, the fluid's too low, your age is too high. By the way, in what other world is a 36-year-old woman called geriatric?
Right.
Yet somebody in obstetrics came up with that term. It's a disempowering term. It has no basis in reality. The age 30, you don't suddenly become higher risk when you go from 34 years and 11 months to 30 on your 35th birthday. Yet it's a label that now will be on the problem list on your doctor's prenatal record. You have advanced maternal age, or your husband is 6'5" and you're 5'4". There's no way that baby's going to fit out of you. Or, your mother had 2 C-sections, your sister had 2 C-sections, you might as well just sign up right now. These are the kind of things that doctors will say. And again, I don't think they do it with malice for the most part. I think they truly believe what they're saying. It makes sense, but that's because they've never looked outside of their own box. And had I not been approached by midwives early in my career, who knows where my career would have gone. And maybe I'd be one of those people that I'm sort of mocking now as look at your outcomes. How can you be happy that you have 30 or 40% of women being sectioned, and that you're telling 40% of women they need to be induced, that nature is flawed almost half the time? That's insane. Okay. So ultrasound is a scary proposition because people like to see their baby. It's very reassuring when it's reassuring. And if you have a practitioner who you trust, then it's reassuring. But to get an ultrasound just because you're a month before your due date is one of the biggest mistakes that you can make. Unless there's a clinical indication of it, your fundal height isn't growing well, your blood pressure is rising, there's some other issue, then I would avoid that at all costs. Because when you get a C-section for no reason at 36 weeks or so, 34, 35, 36 weeks, the chance of you having an intervention in your birth, an induction or a C-section, goes up by 20 or 30%, simply because you had an ultrasound. And it starts that whole problem list growing, which starts for the fetal testing, which starts for the push towards induction, which then gets you back on the whole cascade of interventions that we talked about.
Yeah. So kind of in line with that, what about the length of pregnancy? I know that this has always kind of been something that has been argued at ad nauseum. And I think ultimately, the baby comes when the baby comes. But, maybe there's more to that story that you could elaborate on, because I do feel like so many people are tied to, for example, their due date versus, simply just allowing things to happen on course.
Well, way too much emphasis is put on due date. And the fear of going past your due date in the medical model is the fear of stillbirth, right? Because we know that stillbirth rises beyond about 36 weeks. It goes up every week, statistically speaking. That's not important. What's important is how much does it actually go up, all right? And that gets you to the argument between relative risk and actual risk. And doctors often speak in relative risk. And they often don't speak in actual risk, or they often don't even know what the actual risk is. They'll just say it's risky to keep going. And if you ask them the question, well, how risky is it? They'll say something like, really risky. Well, can you give me a number? And they don't know. They just don't know, right? Stillbirth is never something that you want to look, that you want to deal with. But it happens randomly and rarely, even at 42 and 43 weeks. It's very rare for that to happen. It's just more common than if you were to be induced at 39 weeks. So having a due date is an interesting thing, because it does set you up for everything, because everything we do is based on the due date. The timing for certain testing is based on your due date. All that stuff. So normal biology says that from the moment of conception until average peak of labor is about 266 days. All right. So that's about 8.5 months. We call it 9 months because we usually date from the first day of your last menstrual period. And that is not a date you're pregnant, but it's a date where a woman can actually chart that. So she sort of knows that. But that's assuming a woman has a 28-day cycle, and that she, even when she has a 28-day cycle, that month she actually ovulated on day 14. And that's not something that most people know. You can use these charts and these calculators and you can figure it out. But it doesn't really matter, because when you give birth, it's a bell-shaped curve. And about 95% of people are going to give birth between 37 and 42 weeks. But some are going to give birth earlier, some are going to give birth later, and that's assuming you have accurate dating. The thing about it is, if we consider 40 weeks to be overdue beyond 40 weeks, if you understand the geometry of a bell-shaped curve, that means 50% of women are abnormal. And that is not mathematically or scientifically accurate. So, having a due date makes some sense for planning, but I would advise listeners to, one, keep it loosely. Also, maybe don't tell family members your due date. We always tell them 2 weeks beyond your due date. Like if you do July 7th, tell them you're due the end of July. That way they'll mark it down, and then they won't be calling you on July 8th and July 9th and July 10th and saying, my doctor says you're going overdue. How come your doctor isn't doing anything? And again, meaning well, but planting seeds of anxiety and doubt into you. Some people say that the first babies go longer. It's really interesting. In my own experience, that's not true. I did a couple of papers on term pregnancies, some with breech, some singleton, some on just home birth pregnancies. The average gestational age was actually 40 weeks and 0 days. It was really interesting, with a range of, 35 to 43 and a half weeks. So you have a wide range, but the average was 40 weeks. But it's a very flat bell-shaped curve. Only maybe 6, 7, 8% of women give birth on their due date. Mm-hmm. So your due date shouldn't really mean anything other than it's a time for, planning when you're going to do your diabetic screening, or when you're going to, schedule something if you have to schedule something, or that sort of thing. It just gives you a ballpark figure. It's also for like midwives. That's how they decide how many women they're going to take in a month.
Right.
How many July due dates do they have? Now, that doesn't mean they're all going to be born in July. Some will be born in June, some will be born in August. But they can only take so many. So that's sort of, it's a necessary thing, but it's not something you should bank on.
Yeah,
Right.
It's so interesting because my son was actually born at 41 weeks. And to me, that last week just felt torturous. And I think in a lot of ways it was, not only because I was very pregnant, but also because of the anxiety, like the anticipation that it could happen any minute and it should have already happened. And all of these things kept going through my head. And in a lot of ways, I have wondered in the past if that didn't contribute to the delay in labor starting, because there was so much anxiety around the fact that I was going past my due date. So Yeah.
It's a very common thing that you say because we put so much emphasis on it and because it's such an important life event. All right. Do you know what the secret to happiness is?
I'd love to know.
Okay. I got this from my LA Kings hockey podcast. Jesse Cohen said this. He said, the secret to happiness is having low expectations.
Mm.
Because when you have high expectations, you're often disappointed. When you have low expectations, you're almost never disappointed. so
Right.
so you're much happier. So the idea of going through life and pregnancy and thinking, if I get to 40 weeks, I'm going to start getting anxious is more cultural than it is anything else because people around you start getting anxious and because
Right.
we've been indoctrinated to believe that going past your due date is dangerous. It is not dangerous. There is danger, if you want to use that term, the moment the sperm and egg unite. There's always potential for danger. You can't live your life like that. I imagine that most of us, when we get in the car to drive to the grocery store, are not worried about dying in a car accident. Yet that's the most common time to die in a car accident. So we're able to compartmentalize that. We need to learn to compartmentalize this as well. This is something that nature has designed. My body, you trust your body. Your body got pregnant. Your body grew a baby. Your body's not going to not know how to get the baby out of you. Now, all these things we're talking about, can there be problems? Of course. You can have growth restriction. You could develop preeclampsia. You could, so we're not talking about those. We're talking about the women who don't have a problem, but yet are being categorized by the medicalized birth system as having a problem simply because they're pregnant and doctors see problems wherever they look. That's why we have what's called a problem list on your prenatal record. It's not a diagnosis list, it's a problem list. And here's something really interesting that happened to me. It's an anecdote, but it's a very important one, is that because the medical model looks at pregnancy itself as a high-risk condition, it looks at pregnancy as the number one problem. When you're pregnant, that's the first thing on your problem list is that you're pregnant. It shouldn't be. And when I was in my office taking histories for years, I would always ask somebody about, it's called, the medicalized version of it is you could ask for their chief complaint. I don't even like that term, but chief complaint. And then you ask about symptoms and signs about their chief complaint. And then you go through their meds and their allergies and past medical history, past surgical history, family history, and something called review of systems. That's basic taking a history. So when a woman would come to me with a pregnancy and I would go through everything and I'd get to past medical history, the words just rolled out of my mouth. I would say, so do you have any other medical problems? And I did this for years. And you know where I'm going with this, obviously. And one woman looked at me and she goes, what's the first one? And then I realized that I was saying other medical problems because of my training. Essentially became a part of my language, lexicon. I never even thought about the fact that I was implying that pregnancy is the first one. And so then I've changed the way I asked the question, but I didn't mean it that way, but I could be interpreted that way because that's the way I was trained. Medical system looks at pregnancy as a problem. They're trying to find them. They want you to have a great outcome, but they're going about it the wrong way because they're like a detective looking for a crime. Instead of waiting for you to complain that someone burgled your house, they're coming into your house every day, making sure nothing's missing. Okay.
Right.
It's overkill and it leads to anxiety. And it leads to that whole thing we talked about earlier, where you can't remove a thought once it's been placed into your head.
Right. Right.
So one of my missions in the last years of my career are going to be and have been to teach the normalcy of birth as the norm and let pathology happen when it does, and then we'll deal with it. But not to think of everything as pathology or a pathology waiting to happen. It's not healthy. It's not helpful. And think about what you're doing to your baby when you're worrying all the time or when the people around you are worrying all the time. And then you don't have to justify to your family members your choices either. I mean, your family members have different life experiences and they may think, like you said, everybody thought that you were wacko because you chose to have a home birth. And again, you shouldn't have to hide that information from them, but sometimes it's wiser to just not tell them anything. That's why don't tell people your due date. Don't tell family members your due date. Unless you have a great relationship with your family members, and then they'll be supportive of you. But if you have family members that come from, say, Eastern Europe or different culture where doctors are gods and everything is concerning, there's just disaster around every corner because that's the story of Eastern Europe. It's been the story. Because occasionally I talk to families and I get the sense that they're worried because this happened to them, and therefore it's going to happen to my daughter. And I don't want that to happen. I want her to be in the hospital where it's safest, not realizing that hospitals aren't safest for most women. And they'll say, well, but what if she's that one? And I'll go, that's true. If she's that one, there could be a problem being at home. But what if she's that 40% who didn't need all the interventions they got at the hospital and ended up with a perfectly healthy baby that ended up having to spend 2 days in the NICU because of all the interventions that they did, and didn't get exposed to mom's skin and microbiome and delayed cord clamping and auto transfusion and immediate latching and colostrum and all the things that nature had designed. And what does that lead to down the road? And one of your things that you probably talk about in your podcasts are the incredible rise in chronic illnesses in children. And it's multifactorial for sure, but certainly how we come into this world is contributing to it. It is. You cannot say with any certainty that it isn't. And therefore you should assume that since it parallels all the interventions, that there may be some correlation and causation. We know that doesn't always apply. And then we know that they're not going to look at it. They're not going to study it. They don't really want to know. And you can't really isolate it these days anymore from GMO and 5G and heavy metals from vaccines and all the other stuff that's going on. So it's very, very difficult to isolate it. But we know that your healthy gut flora, which comes from vaginal birthing and skin-to-skin contact, and being, in what they call kangaroo care, where the baby's like with you all the time, is better for the reflexes. It's better for their microbiome. It's better for their breathing. They have far better attachment. They have far better breastfeeding success rate. These things are not to be belittled. The cynical part of it all, Erin, is that nobody makes a lot of money when everybody's perfectly healthy and when you don't need drugs or medication or hospitals or IVs or Pitocin or antibiotics or nurseries or formula. There's no money in not giving hepatitis and vitamin K vaccine. There's no money in that. Right. It's too bad. It's too bad because insurance companies paid for not giving hepatitis vaccine. We probably see a rise in not giving hepatitis vaccine. That's just market forces. That's basic economy 101.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a conversation we've had many times on the podcast. Actually, we had Dr. Paul Thomas on and spoke quite extensively about Hep B vaccine at birth. So, well,
yeah,
Dr. Fischbein.
I've admired his work from afar. I mean, his I read a couple of his books, and we've had conversations ourselves together on his paper that actually was so honest and so truthful. And then, of course, he got vilified for that and pilloried for that. And that just tells you that, he's read the medical community doesn't seem to care if a study is rotten, if it made somebody a lot of money.
Right.
But when it points fingers at you, then they come after you. I know that for a fact myself. I'm trying to get papers published on home birthing and twins and stuff like that. And we're having a hard time in 2024 getting it through peer review because we violate the narrative that it's unsafe to do these things at home. And who are the peer reviewers? The peer reviewers are maternal fetal medicine doctors who work in the machinery.
Well, right? And who likely have never even attended a home birth.
Well, and they're not open to it, you're right, because they've lived in the same box forever and they've never looked out into what else is possible out there. It would be really nice as a positive thing if residents in training for future doctors, they would spend 6 weeks or 2-month elective working with a home birth midwife and having home birth midwives come and spend a month working on labor and delivery and developing some camaraderie and some collaborative integration between the systems. Other countries have that integration. Problem is now they're pushing back on that. Places like England, which were supposed to have these great midwifery hospital integration type systems, they're now having budget problems. And so who do they lay off? The midwives.
Right.
Right. Not the administrators. Right.
Yeah. Oh, Dr. Fischbein, I could talk for several more hours about this topic, but we're reaching the end of our time. We are now at our rapid fire questions. These are 8 questions that I ask of every single one of our guests. They're just designed to give us a little bit of insight into who you are beyond, obstetrician and professional, and to bring a little bit of fun and excitement to the show. So, Dr. Fischbein, number 1, if you could choose only one natural remedy for the rest of your life, what would it be?
Well, it was a tie between vitamin D and Scotch whiskey. Okay. That's a tie. I mean, again, I'm not an herbologist. I'm not. I let my midwives do the homeopathy and the essential oils and the herbs and things like that. I don't know that much, but vitamin D, I think, is a key one. And if a little sip of wine or whiskey in the evening keeps you happy and stuff like that, I don't see any issues with that either.
Just drink it outside, right? Then you're getting the best of both worlds.
Yeah. Okay. There you go. Right.
All right. Tell us something most people don't know about you.
My favorite music is soundtrack music. Is classical music, but written for movies. People don't know that. People obviously, I like 80s music and things like that, the Eagles and the Stones and things from when I was younger. But what soothes me the most and what I find, what I used to listen to at births when I'd be on the couch, just waiting with a lot of downtime at home births, would be soundtrack music. People written by like John Barry, Hans Zimmer, John Williams, Harry Gregson Williams. These are the people that have brought me so much joy in my life, is listening to those.
Nice. If I were to compile a playlist of happy music, what song would you suggest be added?
It would be a soundtrack music from Hans Zimmer from the movie The Last Samurai with Tom Cruise, and it's called A Small Measure of Peace. People should listen to that.
Interesting. I'll take a listen for sure.
Yeah, it's just an absolutely beautiful piece of music.
And number 4, what is your favorite guilty pleasure?
Well, I had a tough one with this one. I came up with movie popcorn,
Nice.
but that's not. I try to keep it clean. So
Yeah.
movie popcorn, right, with butter.
Yeah. Always with butter. You got to have the butter. All right. What is the most influential book you've ever read?
Well, this is the easiest question you asked me because it changed my life. In 1986, I finished my residency. I took 3.5 months. I borrowed some money. I traveled around the world. It was very cheap to do it in those days. And I took a book with me. It's this book right here. And for your people who are listening, it's called Atlas Shrugged by Ayn Rand. And it changed my whole perception of capitalism versus socialism. When you're young, socialism seems like a great idea. And this book changed everything for me. And then more recently, I would say the book that really got me onto a different track was Dissolving Illusions by Suzanne Humphries. Right.
Yeah, another great one. I still need to get Suzanne on the show. So, all right. So, what does the word revolution mean to you?
Okay. So it's a Beatles song for one,
Hmm.
but I'm dating myself. I would say as an American, it means to me overthrowing tyranny.
Mm-hmm.
That's what it means to me.
And what does the word remedy mean to you?
That's a good one. I put down that it's a non-pharmacological healing option like herbs or walking outside barefoot in the grass or having a good conversation with somebody. Essentially, that fixes something. So if it's your soul, get outside. If it's, if you've got certain ache and pain, taking some herbal. So a remedy is something that fixes something, but it doesn't have to be something in a bottle.
Right. Absolutely. Now, lastly, if you could impart one piece of wisdom onto our listeners, what would that be?
Be discerning about who you trust and try not to be a stage 1 thinker, understanding that most of what we read, most headlines, most politicians, most world leaders, they all speak in language that doesn't mean anything. They've not thought it through. For example, like in California, Gavin Newsom says we're going to have all electric cars by 2035. Okay, without any thought of the fact that right now we don't have an electrical grid that can manage what we have already. without a thought of where is the lithium and the cobalt and the other things needed for the batteries going to come from. For these cars are heavier, what's it going to do to the road? I mean, no thought process whatsoever. It's perfect example of stage one thinking. It feels good to say it, but never thinking about, well, what will it actually do? So the piece of wisdom that I would give to your listeners is don't get your information from a headline or from a reel. Do your own homework and trust your gut. Trust your instinct to tell you that this doesn't sound right. And most of us that in my world saw what was coming down with the COVID whole thing, and from the very beginning, this isn't right. This isn't right. And and there were 30% of us or so that stood our ground, and the 70% of people just succumbed, and now they're going to pay for it the rest of their lives. So the people that instituted this upon us will probably never be held to account. So we have to be responsible for our family members and ourselves and those that we love. And you shouldn't rely on me or you, Aaron. People should hear what we have to say and then do their own digging. That's what I would give them is trust yourself and be discerning about who you trust as a guide in other aspects of your life.
100%. I couldn't agree more. So Dr. Fischbein, where can people find you?
Well, I live in a house in southern Utah, and you're welcome to come visit. It's a little town called Kanab, Utah, just outside of Zion National Park. It's really pretty here. But they can find me on Instagram at Birthing Instincts. My website is birthinginstincts.com. My podcast with my colleague Bliss Young is the Birthing Instincts podcast. So it's pretty much you put in Birthing Instincts into a search engine, it's going to come up with something that we're doing. We now have a Patreon, which is behind a paywall for those fellow travelers who want a little bit more deeper dive into things, where we can have honest conversations. We have Zoom things once a month with Q's and A's, and we have a thing every other month called Bringing the Home Birth Hesitant on Board for women who want to have a home birth, but their husband or their mother or their mother-in-law is really skeptical. Bring them on. We're not there to twist arms or anything. We're there to answer questions and to give people a resource for that, and honest talk about some of the current events that are affecting not just pregnancy but mostly pregnancy. But we talk about birth control pills and then how that affects women. We talk about some certain things in politics. We talk about the use of language. I did a thing on Patreon about birthing person versus woman, and we had a conversation about that because we sort of see things a little differently there. And we were two people coming from different angles who love each other and could have a conversation without screaming at each other. Right. And so it's a very valuable asset there. So that's where they can find it. I wrote a book once called Fearless Pregnancy, Wisdom and Reassurance from a Doctor, a Midwife, and a Mom. And most of it is still valuable. The sections on like genetics and stuff, this was from 2010. That's changed dramatically. But, the common sense stuff in there is still commonsensical. And then I teach. So on my website, birthinginstincts.com, you go to the events page. I go around the world. I teach 2-day seminars in breech and twin skills. This is my passion right now, is to keep those skills alive, since my colleagues who run residency programs are not interested in teaching this unique skill that keeps my profession, makes it special. And so women are running out of choices when babies are breech or when mom has twins. They're all funneled down towards the cesarean section with no concern. Again, what happens in their next pregnancy, or what happens to those babies because they're being born by a scheduled C-section rather than letting them experience labor and that sort of thing. So that's my life now. I don't clinically practice anymore. I did for almost 40 years. And the being on call got to me a little too much because I was a solo practitioner, as I might have said earlier. I had no masters, so I was free to do these things that I do, whereas most of my colleagues are not free to do it. They're either employees, or they're part of a big group who say, I'd love to help you as a midwife and take your transports, but my partners won't let me. I never had to deal with that. But being on call every night takes ask any midwife who does this or any doula who does this. You don't get called every night, but you never go to bed certain you won't be called. So it wears on you after a while. And I do want to live a lot longer, and I want to live a healthier life. And that's why I left Los Angeles and moved to southern Utah. And it was a really wise decision for me. Thanks for having me on, Aaron.
Thank you so much, Dr. Fischbein. Hopefully we can do this again because I have a million more questions. Thank you all for listening. Take care, everyone.
With hope as a guiding light, through darkest days we'll fight the night. With a whole lot of passion, with a whole lot of truth, Remedy Revolution is here for you.